Good morning, boys and girls. Today we're going to be learning about the Road to Revolution, Part 1. And listen really carefully to hear about the many conflicts that arose among the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Native Americans after the establishment of the 13 colonies. Listen to find out more about the trail of events that led the colonists to feel less and less like Europeans and eventually to fight for their freedom from Britain. Again, this is Road to Revolution, Part 1. You have learned how the English colonies were established and how the colonists lived their lives. Throughout this time, the English, Spanish, and French fought each other over land in North America. They were land hungry and clashed over the areas of North America they wanted for themselves. The Spanish had forced the French out of what is present-day Florida and gained control of it. The Spanish had also moved into areas of North America now known as New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Texas. The French were colonizing parts of present-day Canada and had also claimed the Mississippi River Valley for France. Whereas some of these land claims resulted in wars on European soil, other clashes were beginning to take place in North America. At the same time, more and more Europeans were coming to the English colonies and searching for new land to settle. They began to move further west, away from the coastal areas where people had first settled. Over time, the Native Americans began to realize that there would be no end to this influx or the incoming arrival of people. In 1675, war broke out in New England. It was time for the Wampanoag to take a stand. Chief Metacom, the son of Chief Massasoit, led a war party against some English settlers. This attack turned out into an all-out conflict. Eventually, the English settlers won, essentially destroying the Wampanoag tribe and taking even more of their land. As the colonies grew, English explorers continued west across the Appalachian Mountains into what is now the Ohio River Valley. However, this land was not uninhabited either. Native Americans had been living in this region for a long, long time, some of them having been forced to move west from the eastern regions to escape the influx of settlers. The French had also claimed a few areas of the Ohio Valley. The French had established a good trading partnership with various native tribes in the area. They didn't want the English settlers to interfere with this business relationship. Neither the Native Americans nor the French wanted English settlers to build homes on this land. However, members of the British Parliament wrote to the French and told them that it was a well-known fact that the land belonged to Great Britain and that the French should go away. The French considered this request and then replied, "No." What do you think that means? That was a bad sign. Conflict was brewing. The Native Americans, distressed by how much land they had already lost, steeled themselves for a fight. To steel yourself is to make yourself strong and ready. They were ready for a fight. So did the French. Yet another war broke out in 1754. This war is known as the French and Indian War. Fought in the forests of North America, this war went on for a very long time, almost 9 years in all. Colonists in North America were asked to fight for this land. Britain also sent thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic Ocean to fight. Many Native Americans in the region, such as the Huron, fought with the French in this war. Others, such as the Iroquois, sided with the British. 2 years later, the war over the colonial territory in North America spread to other parts of the world where France and Great Britain competed for land, such as Europe, the West Indies, and all the way over in India. This phase of the war is known as the 7 Years' War in Great Britain. Eventually, after much conflict, the British captured the French-controlled city of Quebec, Canada. The capture of Quebec in 1759 was a turning point for the British, who eventually won the war. In 1763, the war was over, but this was the beginning of the end for French fortune in North America. Although the French and the British signed a peace treaty, the Native Americans did not. Organized attacks on British settlers continued under the leadership of Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa tribe. These assaults, commonly known as Pontiac's Rebellion, actually involved a vast network of at least 13 Native American tribes which united together. The British soon realized that it would be impossible to defeat this land or the settlers on it. As a result, the British Parliament and King George III decided that settlers could not live on land west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1763, King George issued a proclamation forbidding it. Can you imagine? Having just fought a war for ownership of this land, colonists were now told to stay away from it. Fighting a war for many years is a very expensive thing to do. When it was over, the British Parliament realized that they had spent a great deal of money. Britain was in financial trouble, and someone had to help get them out of it. That someone was the 13 colonies. The Prime Minister of Britain, who's the part of the Parliament, at the end of the French and Indian War, was a man named George Grenville. Grenville was asked to come up with a plan to pay off Britain's debt. He thought long and hard about this and did indeed come up with a plan. How about taxing the colonists? He thought to himself. After all, Great Britain fought the war to defend the colonists against the French and the Native Americans. Grenville presented the plan to King George III and Parliament, and everyone in Britain agreed it was a great plan. In 1764, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This law placed a tax on foreign sugar and molasses. By making foreign sugar and molasses more expensive, the colonists were being forced to buy these goods from the British producers in the West Indies. However, this act did not just include sugar. It also included wine, cloth, coffee, and silk. The colonists were now taxed if they chose to buy less expensive products from nations other than Great Britain. That was the Sugar Act. Then, in 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act stated that all printed material produced in the colonies would be taxed. Newspapers, magazines, legal documents, and believe it or not, even cards would cost more. People were required to buy a stamp and place it on the paper item that they had purchased. In the same year, the Quartering Act was passed by the British Parliament. This meant that colonists had to help provide quarters or temporary places to live for British soldiers stationed in the colonies. The colonists also had to provide supplies such as food, bedding, candles, and firewood. Boys and girls, that means if they arrived at your house and needed a place to stay, that you had to give up your bedroom. You had to feed them your food. You had to give them your bedding, candles, and firewood, whether you wanted to or not. For many years, the colonists had handled their own affairs. But now members of a government 3,000 miles away had voted to tax the colonists. The colonists were not allowed to vote for these British leaders, so they felt their views and thoughts were not represented in the British government. Many colonists believed that it was unfair that they had to pay taxes but did not have representation or someone to speak for them in the British Parliament. Let me read this again. This is a huge, huge, huge concept. The colonists were not allowed to vote for British leaders, so they felt their views and thoughts were not represented in the British government. Hold on a second, Elena. Many colonists believed that it was unfair that they had to pay taxes but did not have representation in the British Parliament. The British responded that members of Parliament considered the interests of the entire empire and not simply the areas they represented. Although most people had accepted the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act, they were not prepared to accept the Stamp Act without a fight. Some outspoken colonists began to suggest that they should not pay it. They cried, "No taxation without representation." And that's the end of our reading for today.